Hello folks, my name is Pastor Darren. I'm here with Pastor Alex. You may have noticed we haven't been on YouTube for a while. It's good to be back answering your questions. And the reason we're doing this today, as you may have noticed, we're doing quite an interesting sermon series at the moment called A Body, a Guide for Occupants. These are complicated, heavy and weighty subjects, and it's only natural in the limited time we have on Sundays. And there'll be many more questions. We've invited you to send some in, and we thank you for doing that. Pastor Alex is going to try to answer some of them for us. I don't know who has written in, and that's okay. But perhaps, Alex, we could start. We got one question. Children get aborted. What happens to them when they die?
Good question. Hi, everyone. Again, thanks for sending in your questions. Darren, if I may, just before I answer that question, on Sunday, we had a question in person at our 11:30 service. Someone asked, how would I respond to someone who has had an abortion? And in my answer, I began talking about the scale, the scope of moral responsibility. A lot of it, of my response and talking with someone depends on reasons for which someone has sought an abortion. That is a big question, and I was hoping to answer it now. But as I planned, it just goes too long. So can I instead refer you to the Undeceptions podcast, which is a great resource. John Dixon actually speaking to eminent women qualified in this field. It's a much more thorough response than what I could give right now. Undeceptions.com, you can find the pro-life podcast there. In answer to your question, Darren, what happens to babies who are terminated, who are aborted? In many respects, it's the same as what happens to newborn children who die before they're able to make a response to God, and they die. What happens? Well, in many respects, we simply don't know. The Bible doesn't provide a clear answer to that question. And it's a very sensitive, weighty answer, particularly for those who are going through tremendous grief. What we can go back to are two things. First of all, God's character. We know that God is a God of justice and a God of love and a God of mercy. He will act in accordance to his character. But secondly, there is a spot in the Bible, in 2 Samuel 12. It's after David and Bathsheba have committed adultery. There's been a child born to that adultery, and the child of that situation dies. In 2 Samuel 12, David is mourning before this child dies. He's grieving, he's fasting, he's hoping that God will save this child. But once the child dies, it's almost like David switches. He stops grieving, and his servants are asking him why. Why doesn't he continue to grieve? David says something fascinating in verse 23. He says, the child will not return to him, but David will go to the child. In other words, there's a hint that there is afterlife where David and this child, his son, will be together. We rely on the character and the goodness of God, and we know in the Bible that we can trust him. God will do what is right.
Thanks, Alex. It reminds me as well of I don't know who asked this question or their motives, but often these sorts of questions, it's a concern for God's justice behind it. It's not too dissimilar to a question we often get at Christianity Explored. What about people who've never heard the gospel in distant lands where there's no church? And I have to say, well, are we saying that we think we have a higher sense of justice than God does, or can we trust what the Bible says in his perfect idea of justice? Oh, thank you for that. Another question, which is no easy answer either, is we love to talk about God being sovereign. And as Psalm 139 on Sunday said, if God has ordained all of our days, how can God still be sovereign and allow so many children to be aborted?
Yeah, it's an incredible question. As you point out, God says, well, David says of God, you've ordained all my days before one of them came to be. Yeah. If that's possible, then why wouldn't God stop terminations? The same question could be said, really, of any innocent suffering in the world. Yes. At the moment, there's war in Ukraine, many innocent people suffering. There's 23 million people, from what I understand, displaced in Pakistan from floodings. There's famine in Eastern Africa. Why doesn't God do anything about this? Why doesn't God cause innocent suffering to stop? The reality is, we don't know. With Job, we're not given particular reasons in specific circumstances why suffering happens. This side of heaven, often we just do not know. What we can, again, rely upon is what God tells us about himself and what he tells us about us. Yes. In the Bible, we see two truths that seem contradictory, but those two truths are maintained. On the one hand, God is absolutely sovereign. Nothing happens without his knowledge, including the premature termination, the premature destruction of innocent lives, in this case of unborn babies. Nothing happens without his knowing. But then on the other hand, humans are absolutely responsible. We choose. We're responsible for our sins and the consequences of those. And those two things are kept in tension all the way through the Bible. Yes. When Joseph talks to his brothers, they're afraid that he's going to seek revenge on them. Yes. He says to them, you meant it. You meant all the things that you did to me for evil.
Yes.
They're responsible, but God meant it for good, the saving of many lives. Those tensions are kept together in the Bible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start. Job and Joseph, aspects of Daniel's life as well, how God was still in control and good even throughout tremendous disappointments. And I'd also be thinking, trying to hold up, I like what Tim Keller often says about we have to keep reminding ourselves what we do know of God and our situation, and we know it is not because he doesn't love us, and because the most supreme display of God's love and how he was for us was breaking into a sinful world and sending his son on our behalf to die on the cross. So I have to hold up my doubts and frustrations at the world, hold it up against the cross and the truth I do know that to be real in the gospel. And that's how I can face suffering in the world. I think if I didn't have the cross, I think looking at these things would be completely hopeless, full of despair. So really good question. We'll keep moving on. We've got one more, and it's really, Alex, perhaps something that's affected your life, but how could we care better as a church for families with disabled children or disabled members of our church?
Yeah, it is a question that touches home for many of us. First of all, I guess it's understanding. Seek to understand the situation of parents or disabled people. For Megan and I, for instance, some days are easy, some days are hard. Sometimes we find a lot of joy in our disabled son. Other times it's really difficult. I remember once when we've been really blessed in the school that he's in, but when we first went to that school to decide whether we admit Eddie there, it was a real strong point of grieving, because it was a realisation, actually, does our son need this? Well, yes, he does. That was part of the grieving process. And for a lot of disabled people or their parents, that grief comes and goes. The acceptance comes and goes. The question and confusion comes and goes. So just be understanding of that and their situation. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's support. Having support structures in place for people with disabilities. And that's a whole society issue. Having schools, having therapy, having understanding. A lot of that comes with funding because it's not cheap to do all this. It also comes at a church level. We want to be a church where it's easy for us to bring disabled children here or disabled people. Wheelchair access, programs in place, things where we're careful not to exclude people, even through our own naivety or good intentions. So that comes with being informed. So make sure you're informed. And a lot of that information, that sense of understanding and support, just comes through getting to know parents with children with special needs, pushing through that sort of awkwardness. We've been really blessed, I want to say, at St Andrews with friends and church members who've been really helpful for us in providing practical support and understanding and engaging our son on his level. That's been really helpful. Lastly, develop your theology of weakness. I talked about this a little bit on Sunday. We don't esteem to weakness. We spend our whole lives making sure we're self-sufficient and independent and strong. And so we find weakness, particularly physical weakness, we often see in the disabled, as being something very difficult to handle. And so therefore we try to put our, we often put our disabled people to the side. But recognise the weakness in your own life. and recognise that God works most powerfully through our weakness. Whatever situation you're going through in life, whether it could be acute suffering, or you feel things are out of your control, or you feel because of your own sin or something that someone's done to you, you feel acute shame, recognise that this is an opportunity to draw you closer to God in trust and love and support. So understanding support, theology of weakness.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And it reminds me as well, when I read the Gospels, Jesus did have a special concern for the vulnerable in the society.
Yeah.
In the Old Testament, we see how God built in structures into their religious and social code to care for the vulnerable. And I think this is a way for us as Christians to live out really countercultural lives that people notice. We take it for granted that the human secular view of the vulnerable and the weak is the same as the Christian view, but history shows us that is not true. And Christians and the Jews, they've always sought to take care of those on the edge of society, those who are vulnerable, those in need, those who are weak. And this is a really interesting way, I think, for us to live out God's mission, also do evangelism, but live out countercultural lives of the gospel as well. So I think that's enough for today. Thank you for those questions. Do keep them coming in. There'll be an email on the screen. This Sunday, we have the interesting topic of sexuality and gender. I really hope you'll come along on Sunday, listen to what Alex has to say, and perhaps we'll try to answer some more questions next week as well. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.